Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us once again. We're back indoors for Common Sanity episode insert number here. and I'm joined today, I'm delighted to say, by Suzanne Moore, James, how do you pronounce it?
Innes-Smith.
Innes-Smith. I just wanted to get it exactly right. And James Chiavarini, our host, who has never sat down with us before and has been focused on delivering the food on time. and today, very broadly speaking, we are discussing men and women. Can they get along together? No.
Sorry,
and then having answered that question so abruptly and decisively, what remains to discuss? So yes, hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation. It was partly inspired by a conversation I had with James some years ago. You were doing a podcast with somebody else.
Yeah, Dr. Stephen Blumenthal.
Yeah.
Psychologist. And yeah, no, you were very interesting actually.
And that was roughly around, I guess, crisis in masculinity, a sense that men had lost their way a little bit and weren't sure what was expected of them.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen works very much with young men who have problems with self-esteem and mental health and all that stuff. So he's at the sort of sharp end. But he's fascinating because, he comes at it from a medical perspective.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of wise words on the subject, and it's not poor old men, aren't they, hard done by.
Right.
It's very much evidence based, and he's fascinating. He's down working for television.
And now Suzanne wrote something recently on Jordan Peterson's second book, and that was a really interesting commission, I thought, because I suppose if you have a reputation, at the risk of oversimplifying it, you are seen as somebody who is sceptical perhaps about the claims to victimhood of men, and certainly middle-class men, and Jordan Peterson had come into your process before that. But your review of his book was, and also your Substack about the experience, was more sympathetic than I thought I might have expected. Or nuanced, let's say, that's always the word.
Well, he's... My youngest daughter is obsessed with Peterson because and she said something to me very interesting the other day. Do you know who
I interviewed him a couple of years ago in Cambridge, actually.
Okay. You must tell me about it. But she said to me the other day that his latest YouTube or whatever it is, he was. I think it was like Russell Brand. He was sort of practically crying most
He
of
was,
it.
yeah.
And it's so this idea that he's.
You know why he was crying on that one? He was crying with gratitude because somebody come up to him on the street and said, "Thank you for helping me improve my life." And he was like, "I want to know more. What exactly is it that I said that helped you?" And the man explained.
It's such a bizarre
and it really was
mixture.
a very strange.
I think his tears are genuine.
Yeah,
flow. I think he does genuinely. I think he does genuinely. He's a true believer.
I think he's a bit on the edge, isn't he?
Yeah.
After that story, the actual story of what happened to him, being put on antidepressants and not realising that you can get addicted.
My dad knew that in the 80s.
We all knew that. And he's this clinical psychologist.
It's like Michaela. Is it Michaela, the daughter? It's sort of taken over the running.
Well, she's a big business now with her I have to say, that diet is insane.
Well, the meat
Just
one.
pure beef.
What do they call it? Animals that...
Ruminants.
Ruminants, that's it. That's not a word I ever think about. But the poor mother, Tammy, who's recovered from the cancer, she can't eat. She's gone on it now, but she can't eat goats. So she...
No cloven hooves.
So her diet is even more...
She's looking
Like
good
just
on it.
one Jewish fridge.
She's making money.
As you said, she had excuse me, my mouthful, but she has had rheumatoid arthritis, I think.
Which is awful.
I think if you have a severe autoimmune issues, then a restricted diet can help over a short period of time. But I think eventually, your body does need to get back to it.
And I dealt with this with a family member, and rheumatoid arthritis is horrible disease, especially in young people.
Yeah.
It is horrible. They do, you go through excluding certain groups to see what works, but you don't. Only
The funny thing with Jordan Peterson, I think, and he was a fairly good place to start with this conversation because he's kind of the icon, I suppose, of what should men do to try
Yeah,
and
he certainly
kind of
liked
get
him.
themselves. Yeah. The story of his own personal journey in the last 2 years just seems hugely overwritten. I mean, you couldn't find a set of more absurdly dramatised
Yeah.
events to counterpoint it. You know, he's literally gone on a sort of Jungian journey through the belly of the dragon, or whatever, isn't he? It's just, I mean, I almost feel like it's, I almost feel sceptical about the truth to an extent. You know what I mean? If it weren't, and yet when you see him, I think he's genuine. But
What do you mean with the timing of the book?
well, not like to sell books. I don't know what I think, but it's just so extraordinary that he should talk in those terms of what one must do in order to, you know, confront, you know, the epics of Gilgamesh and Beowulf and all that sort of thing. And then there he is in a medically induced coma in Russia.
I mean that. It's just that his I suppose for me, his view of men are order and women are chaos.
Yeah.
And in fact, he is chaos.
He is chaos. Well, he embraces chaos much more than his objective, explicit, avowed views would suggest you would expect him to. Certainly, he seems to go there.
When I was reading, especially the second book, I did get a sense of him as an actual therapist. And I did a couple of years training myself as a therapist, and you can sort of see that he's probably quite good, actually. You know, he has empathy with people. You know, it could be someone you wouldn't imagine him to have. I could see that in him. He's not this hard and you have to do it this way.
It's not a taskmaster.
No. And that.
I think he'd be a listener. I think he would.
And that made me, because I came to him. He was sort of presented as you would hate this, but when I read it, I thought, no, I can see in your practice you probably do have.
The thing that I find interesting about him is that point of view, like you will hate this, that he did become a hate figure for the left. I say the left,
Yeah, he became a lightning rod.
terms. Yeah. And I thought, of all the people, I understand why you don't like the alt-right, I understand why you don't like the types like Stefan, what's his name, Molyneux and all those kind of guys who tell women to use their eggs while they're fresh and all that sort of thing, you know. There's a lot of stuff that I can understand why that kind of ruffles feathers. But he was so focused on enabling young people to take responsibility for themselves. It seemed extraordinary. I thought that was telling us something about what these culture wars are really about. I say culture wars.
But why did that get people's backs up? Is it
Exactly.
the fact that it was for boys and men rather than, because if it had been about women and girls, I'm sure there wouldn't have been the same.
I think that some of it was because he was embraced by
association with them.
by right-wing incels or whatever you want to call them, or men's rights activists who really are actively hostile to women.
Yeah.
This is not his fault, but he was. And he became a figurehead.
Was that just the trans thing? With his rejection of imposed pronouns?
I think that was at the beginning, and then he went on a massive. In a way, it's no wonder he had a kind of breakdown when you looked at his touring schedule. He was like in a different city every night. You know, it's this person who's had a kind of quiet, sheltered life, and suddenly.
And especially, I watched his O2 one with Sam Harris and Douglas Murray was adjudicating. And it was really interesting to see three very different approaches to public speaking. And it's what I always loved about Peterson and still do it, is what you see on Russell Brand podcast, which is brand hosting, I think that one. It's the intensity of his involvement, his engagement. It's like
evangelical.
Powers of magnitude higher than Sam Harris can phone that shit in all day. He can sit in a studio or on stage, or he can be on Bill Maher's show confronting Ben Affleck, calling him an Islamophobe. And his blood pressure wouldn't rise, his pulse rate wouldn't differ. You can see it in his eyes. He's like some Mekon or whatever. You know, he's like. I mean, he's a high intellect, Sam Harris. I'm not calling him a fraud or a grifter. He's made a huge contribution, I think, to our understanding of the world. But he can just keep it there.
But maybe
Jordan Peterson was he's like clinging to the wreckage, you know, the whole time. He's like.
But that's why he's compelling, isn't it?
Because
on one hand, he's saying, men, you've got to sort of toughen up, and, you know, blah blah blah. And then he's just this kind of ball of it, emotion. And
Yeah.
it's so emotional.
Yeah.
I think there may be
And
a
I
little
think
bit
that
of
really
Jesus
helps him, though, in one
complex
sense.
going
I think his
on.
breakdown in one
And
sense.
the responsibility that comes with that must be,
Yeah,
you
which
know.
is why it's interesting watching him talk to Brand, because Brand definitely had that. He did a whole show called Messiah
Oh,
Complex.
yes.
And he's quite self-aware now, Russell Brand. I
Is he?
disliked him early on, but well, let's say at least the way he discusses himself on his own podcast seems to suggest to me a certain erotic distance.
Can I?
Yeah, go
can
ahead,
I,
yeah, of course.
Wade in there.
You're fighting for the same territory, so I can
Oh,
understand.
no, I am not. Can I just say?
You've got the same haircut, and I've got to say, it suits you better, I would say.
Can I just say that in my long history of writing, very few people have tried to sue me for libel.
Oh, really?
But I'll just give you three names of people who did. Hugh Hefner tried to sue me for saying he was a pimp and his girlfriend were prostitutes. And I thought, let that one go to court, lovely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nadine Dorris tried to sue me for an actual quote that she had given as libelous, because she's just balmy, bonkers. And Russell Brand tried to sue me for saying that his first book was ghostwritten, and I know the ghostwriter. So I'm not keen on...
Was that a book you wrote?
Yes. I'm not keen on at that time he was the biggest anarchist in the world. So I'm not keen on people, you know.
Yeah.
Suing people, yeah. It's a terrible.
I just don't know what to
It
believe
didn't-
when he
it
opens
didn't-
his mouth.
It didn't happen. Anyway, it didn't happen. And because obviously,
Well, he obviously knew that he didn't have a leg to stand on.
you know,
Yeah.
the newspaper just, lawyers just sort of, I had to write this apology that went under the column, which actually made it seem even worse. You know, when you can word things
Yeah.
in such
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
But
That's
I've
terrible.
seen-
I'm
but I've
surprised as
seen-
well, because he is quite capable of writing a book like that. I don't
Well,
think
anyway.
it's just a question of laziness, isn't it? It's not like
but anyway, I've seen him live as well, and God, I mean, yeah, I don't know if he's like Peterson, because he was so feeding off his fans, and at one point he said, you know, I can go all night, you know, and sort of, you know, the girls, you know, who would fancy him and go. And I think, oh please, no. I mean, you've done like 2.5 hours already. I mean, there's no stopping.
he's not like Peterson in lots of important respects, only in that Messiah complex.
I don't think Peterson's a narcissist as well.
No, I don't think
And I
he
don't
is.
think he has a sense of entitlement.
He
I
has
think
the
Peterson,
Messiah complex he has is almost like literally a sense of like the passion of the Christ.
Yeah,
you
the
know,
Paschal
rather than
mystery.
like come to me.
Yeah.
He's like in the pain. You know?
he sees
Yeah.
himself as that sort of way. Little Lord of
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Sort of talk. Yeah, talk stuff.
But the chaotic element of Jordan Peterson is what makes him human. It's what makes him fascinating.
Yeah,
it's a bit like you know characters. Maybe the character like Lucifer and how that's lot. You know, you can identify with these characters because they are so flawed. And I think that the like you said, the sort of Jungian journey that he's gone on in the last couple of years has only made him stronger in one sense, because you can, you know, he's not this top-down, you know, drill sergeant fella telling you know wagging your finger at the boys.
Of
saying,
which I do find those guys that would just
Oh, they're awful.
brief, but they're like Jocko Willing, you know,
Yeah.
this kind of Navy SEAL
That
character
kind,
who
you know.
wakes up at 4:30 every morning and posts a picture of his digital watch.
Yeah.
Fuck off!
But is it,
You went to bed at 7 o'clock. That's
That's
not
not
like
heroic.
discipline. That's just weird, skewed values. You know, the good
Marky
stuff
Mark.
happens at night.
do you have a sense that people think about Peterson as a kind of father figure, flawed
Yeah.
father?
Very much.
Yeah.
And I think he's let down mostly by his fans.
Right.
I think he's misunderstood mostly by his fans. I think generally, I think 90% of what he says is misconstrued, and I think a lot of that misconstruction comes from his fans,
Not
and they twist
not
it.
all his fans, but
No.
some very vocal.
But a lot of it.
ones,
If you look on YouTube, the amount of videos that are labelled like Jordan Peterson destroys so and so,
Oh yes, I
and
know.
you think,
I
I
know.
bet it's just so pathetic, you know. And I think that in one sense, maybe he's enabled that, maybe he has no control over that. I mean, that's a different argument.
Well, he is super sensitive.
Mm.
If he does an interview, I mean, the Sunday Times.
Oh, the Deccan Aiken.
Yes.
Yeah, he was like serious.
Yes, he was. And
Well, the big one is he broke in this country, and I think it was important to him generally, was the Cathy Newman.
Yeah.
Wasn't
Yeah.
it? And in a way, I mean, I loved it because I had been tired of seeing a lot of people denigrating him, and I was like, no, he's intelligent, he knows what he's talking about, he's thought these things through more than you think. And there was, I mean, yeah, it kind of was like, it felt to me, not Cathy Newman as an individual, but Channel 4 News as an entity, and a sort of establishment of a certain kind of, like, very much a representative of a certain kind of mindset, had completely underestimated him and had come, you know, with a knife to a gunfight, basically,
Yes.
and they were exposed. And then they
Unlike
resorted
Helen
to
Lewis.
all this, oh no, there's online abuse stuff. And I was satisfied, but in hindsight, I think actually it was a shame, because it created that sense of him immediately being this, you know, a kind of jousting match.
Yes.
But the Helen Lewis interview was much more interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Helen,
And
Helen,
she
Helen's
was
great.
intelligent and prepared, and she knew
The
what.
one with the news quiz with her tomorrow.
Oh, I know.
She's so smart
I
and
think
she's so
Helen was
erudite.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. But she was getting on, wasn't she? On yes, he does know certain things. Well, he doesn't know about everything. I mean, so when he's talking about biology and lobsters, and you know, we are basically lobsters, and we're not. You know, I mean, we're not. And there's you can take apart some of his arguments, but he has hit he's hit some. Again, it is an emotional nerves. It's about people needing order, wanting order, feeling. I don't know what their gender roles mean.
Yeah.
But I suppose, you know, he's ultra conservative.
The recognition that history's solutions to historical problems, to deep seated problems, weren't simply to be dismissed out of hand as being simply artefacts of a patriarchal, you know, culture that had been and gone and its thumbs up.
But he reminds. I don't know if you read her at the time, but I went over it was in the 90s to interview Camille Paglia.
Yeah.
And they remind me of each other.
Well, they interview each other. They have great conversations on that.
I haven't seen that because she was doing the same thing. She was sort of saying, basically,
Sexual persona.
there are these archetypes, and you know, there haven't been any great. There hasn't been a female, you know, Mozart, and there never will be. Men and women are wired up differently, and so lots of feminist people like me was sort of arguing with her because it was too determined, biologically determined.
She's brilliantly astute on the Rolling Stones as well. Where has testosterone gone from pop music?
Yes.
That's a great speech.
I mean, I spent 2 days with her. And my God, I was
Exhausted.
yes. Because at that point, she was. I think now she says she's trans, but she was a lesbian, but she couldn't get a girlfriend. She shouts at you the whole time. I can't get a girlfriend, which is wherever you are, you
Can't
know.
get no satisfaction.
And it's just, but we went to this. She took me to this restaurant, and you know, so when we were in her university,
Was she Chicago?
no, was it
She's East
Scotland?
Coast.
Yeah,
Or
not
Midwest London.
Pennsylvania. Anyway, we're in, and clearly her students love her. They love her because she's passionate. But we went to this restaurant. You know how in the States, especially in that part of the States, you get soft shell from the crab. Well, it wasn't. She just had we had a normal crab, and she just ate it.
The bloke.
I mean, it's like, and the photographer over to was just looking at each other, and she's like, "What are you looking at?" And then, that was the first course, and I just sort of sat there because she literally just ate this crab. And then, of course, for the main, she had raw steak. I mean, absolutely, and it was just exactly what you imagined that she would be. And then I started phoning up with some of her, because I was doing some profile, and I phoning up some of her friends, and they said, "No, she has nothing. She just has one chair in her room. She's not particularly easy enough." But she's super intelligent.
She is quite masculine, isn't she?
Her style is quite forthright, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, I'm just going to tell you something. But it was also hilarious because you know, at that point you could get her to slag off any other feminist line or German. You know, she would just tear them to pieces.
Does she have any that she likes, in fact? I mean, are there any that she admires?
Maybe she now would.
Hoff Summers, possibly.
She's quite. I mean, I see where she's like conservative, but she's kind of a bit. She's quite middle of the road in a way, isn't she? It's not really a philosopher. It's more like she's more like a commentator on.
I think she did have respect for German in a sort of way, but I mean, but it was just.
Was that before you had your like running with the Guardian establishment? That I sense. I might be wrong, but I sense that you know, when you were like turned on by allies, Had you felt that
last
you
year?
personally? Yeah.
Yeah.
But this was before that, was it? I don't know if that has changed your view of the sort of that.
Oh yeah.
Feminist
That's all.
whatever.
That's all. What do you want to do?
No, I don't want to but I just mean in terms of looking at Camille Parlier.
No, because that was in the 90s. I suppose I guess I've always been interested in figures who aren't going to adhere to the orthodoxy. I don't have to agree with them. They interest me, and for me, the Guardian on the left, as it had become, especially as a Corbyn, you just had to think these things. There's tick box of that. You have to think this on race, you have to think this on anti-Semitism, you have to think this on Palestine. I felt increasingly, and I do feel that there isn't much original thinking going on, and nor is it working for them politically.
And this is a function of academia as much as anything. I think the more you think about things, the more you find little, what they call it, the vanity of small differences. I can't remember whose phrase it is. Is it Freud maybe? But it's like there's this thing that infests academia. That you start off thinking, I'm going to take on this big problem in society, and after a while you start to find little differences with the other people who have identified that same big problem.
Yes.
And you just become more and more, and I almost wonder whether it isn't a brilliant kind of immune system that society and the establishment has, that it somehow creates, you break up on impact.
When we were talking to Hadley, what happened for you?
Was she?
Yeah.
Hadley
That was a Zoom meeting. I would love to have had the lunch probably.
Hadley was one of the people who's publicly stuck her neck out for me. Because meanwhile, everybody was messaging me, this is wrong,
But surely your fellow journalists are all backing you, because it goes against every journalist's bone in his body not to take, not to go against orthodox.
I think we're of a generation that thinks that.
Where's the joy in not popping bubbles?
All the big names, if you like, were saying yes, this is ridiculous. But some digital doodah in Australia, I'd upset them, because I said that biological sex existed. So,
do you think that's got much time left to run? That particular shibboleth of orthodoxy?
That's the one that's going to break it, I think.
Well, today obviously I'm watching the Mayor Forrester case.
Is it good that the boundaries between the genders then, in that respect, are blurring? I mean, going back to your talking about rock stars earlier, the idea, you think of Robert Plant, he's so big, healthy,
high-pitched.
yeah, but he's so
Every
tall.
vocalist always kind of, they had a kind of high
Whereas
banky
Chris,
wail.
whatever his name from Coldplay, sings from his nose, and
Sam
his
Smith
bosom.
sings from his sort of
He doesn't.
identity, yeah.
I think that's significant. I think
No, I
that,
definitely
the fact
agree.
that we don't have not macho, but masculine singing.
Well, the blues, my son is 14 and he's basically in a really productive lockdown. I envy him. He's taught himself electric guitar and he plays along with like the bands that I kind of go, okay, and I put on Since I've Been Loving You, is that right?
Yeah.
And I just realised you couldn't release a song like that now. It would just be absurd. I'm not saying it would be banned or people would be angry. They just wouldn't understand it. A song in which a young man expresses that kind of angst, that kind of unhappiness with the contract in which he finds himself with the soul of a woman was created below. It's like, the blues expresses really deep, irresolvable differences, whereas most of my daughter, she's 16, most of her kind of generation now, hardly see any difference. They have sleepovers, male and female, they all just kind of meshed, like baby rats or something.
Is that a step forward, do you think, or is that
Well, I don't know, it's
dangerous?
Yeah.
No, I feel quite hopeful when I see my kids. They're older than us, but they would all sing the Pied Pumpkins.
But I wonder how much of this is because there is no sense of being attached to a more primordial sense of who you are.
Yeah, right.
In the sense that if you think about when we all worked the land, when we all lived in an agrarian economy, you did the job that your father did, that his father did before that, and there was a certain expectation of
Yeah.
what you were going to be.
No,
And I think in a world where anybody can become anything, when all opportunities are open to them, you can literally leave home at 16 and go and work in Beijing or Hong Kong, wherever you want.
Yeah.
How much of that is this a problem of abundance? So you can say, well, I can choose this or I can choose that, and all of a sudden you have this paradox of choice where everything's open to you. And you think, but you're still paradoxically weightless. You still feel like you're disconnected from something.
Did you have a citizen of the world time in your life? Because I certainly did.
Not really, not really. I sort of left school and went to work in France for a while. Both my parents emigrated across. My mum came over when she was a baby in arms, and my dad came here to work as a miner. And I really wanted that sort of baptism of fire when I was like 17, 18. I really wanted to find that initiation into being who I wanted to be. But I mean, most of my friends just went to Thailand and hung out with some idiot called Jeremy Mungo. Do you know what I mean? It's like that's not.
They still do. Well, apart from the pandemic, they still do.
That's not really much. That's not really much of a kind of initiation, right? Do you know what I mean? And I would, and also this whole thing that Paul was saying the other day, Paul Embry was saying that we don't have any apprenticeships left. We don't really have. We denigrate manual labour now.
Yeah.
So there is this whole thing of so it just. A sense of it just breeds more and more and more.
And I have a friend
who word entitlement.
Who I won't name, but he's quite well versed in these things. I would trust him on his evidence to support this assertion. He says that in the immediate post-war era, Britain still had a tradition of, I think there's SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were like machine shops, a lot of engineering, that kind of work. And men, mostly, would pass on to young men mostly, but there were also female equivalents. Understanding, knowledge, experience, training, it was done quite organically, and a succession of British governments quite deliberately dismantled that and imported American-style mass production as the way of the future, because it's the only way to be efficient and to compete on the world economic stage. And then, of course, that was a disaster as soon as we were out-competed in a matter of months, because they had, America at least, had built up the capital of having that from the days of Henry Ford. We had about 20 years before Japan shot past us, and we've never got it back.
I saw that growing up. I grew up in Suffolk, and all the, it wasn't like that, because I'm so old, but there were little fields, and then agribusiness moved in. So it's all those big, huge, plantations. So the boys I knew,
Deserts.
yes, that's right. So all the boys I knew, who would have got their dad's pig farm, were then just labourers, and they were demoted in a sense. They didn't have their own little land. But back to your question, what is it that makes someone choose or feel grounded or want to have an identity? I mean, you can see that a lot of kids are, and I'm not saying this. I don't want to patronise kids, because I think a lot of them are way ahead of us. But this whole thing, I'm not going to declare my gender. I'm going to be non-binary. I'm not going to be pinned down. Is a way to try to at least be interesting and individual, and they all do the same thing actually. By the head,
like tattoos.
Yeah, but it's not something. I mean, I would like gender roles to be less stereotyped. And I mean, when my daughter had, recently had a baby, I mean, I have never seen. Obviously, I don't hang around baby shops, but everything is now pink or blue. I mean, gender has become even more codified than when I had my kids.
Did in the 1950s
How much
Bewitched
of
or something.
that is natural? Just
Oh, it can't. That much pink cannot be natural.
It's marketing bullshit, and I do totally agree with that it's become very toxic. At the exact same time that intelligent, intellectual, and maybe left-leaning people are questioning it all, the market has gone completely the other way, and it's like, or I'd say the market that advertises frankly to those people who are not reading the Guardian. It's reacted with, it's just absolutely stomach-churning. The kind of, I mean, there are Twitter accounts that will highlight, why is this a girl's toy? Why is this a boy's toy? And they get angry about it and go, oh, for God's sake, it's just a toy.
Yeah.
But then you see, yes, there are bibs for boys with rockets on, and for girls with princesses on.
Yeah,
that's like the 1950s. That isn't going to happen. That isn't even the case in my own family. I have one of each. It's a small sample.
I thought they'd done tests where girls do tend to go for the fluffy, unicorny things, and the boys tend to go for the cars.
It's that
and the
tend
lorries.
to thing, isn't it? That's the thing. I think if you've got a dividing line in the middle, and the boys are 55%, and the girls are 45% on trucks and rocket ships,
Yeah.
and then you use that to say, therefore, all girls, toys and bibs and sleeper suits and everything else will be in this mode. Then you've massively overplayed
So
your hand.
what's
I think.
okay? Why is that? Why should that be harmful to if you feed your kid the fact that girls wear shoes? What's the worst thing?
Well, I think for a lot of mothers going out to shop for a start, they feel that they're being asked to assign a certain kind of role to their daughter at the age of 6 months, whenever they don't feel comfortable with. I can definitely understand why that would be aggravating.
Well, nobody likes to be marketed at, but at the same time, if it's
I mean,
tradition, then
I do think a lot of it is, to be honest, is simply mass marketing, mass production, mass manufacturing.
It probably all comes out of the
Everything
same
comes
factory
from
in China.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that is actually, what was his name? The Small is Beautiful guy, like 1973 or whatever, said like, when you have problems like this, 9 times out of 10 it's because things are done at scale. Because the economies of scale have overwhelmed all the other considerations that might make life
isn't it
better.
more worrying the sexualisation?
Oh, that's also very
Especially with
that's
girls.
hideous, yeah.
But that is that is where it is. The 9 is everything pink, but it's like training you up to be a little housewife, and then and then once
A little Ariana Grande.
from about 5 or 6, it's t-shirts with really quite sexy slogans and stuff.
Whereas proud.
But which surely makes everybody feel a bit, there's all of that.
That is shameless, I think, as well as from a marketing perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to go down that route, there's no end.
Have you're from a Mediterranean family where there is a
Yes,
degree of
I think
solidity. There's a structure and a framework. So many, I think, British and I would suspect American kids are growing up without that now, without any sort of expectation of any kind of uncle or. We were talking, I know, like just between us, but it's obviously relevant, about that kind of rites of passage moment where there's like a 13, 14-year-old boy, and you go out, the dad and a couple of uncles and a couple of, older brothers or cousins or whatever, and he has a sort of a night of, it's a bit of a roller coaster,
Yes.
he might be exposed to a degree of humiliation or barrack room sort of, teasing or whatever, and then he's also brought in and, you're all right. It's absent. You're just cast out. I don't know at what point they go. Many of them never know they were there in the first place.
that idea of
God, I sound like Jordan Peterson.
That's the entire point of inviting him.
Snagged.
but ritual is really important. Rites of passage.
Very much.
We've lost that in lots
For
of
men,
ways.
for men, we've lost it for centuries. We haven't had that since the Knights of the Middle Ages. And
I think-
it wasn't about you. It was about the part that you play in the wider society. It was about looking after the widows and the orphans. You could only be a knight if you looked after the oppressed and the helpless. That's why you didn't become a knight to get rich.
Gangs have stepped into that gap at
That's what
times
people
around
say.
society, but I don't know how big they are. They're certainly not in my son's life.
We've
I don't know if they are
got
in
over
his.
30% of families in London now
Right.
don't have a stable father or mother. And
Right.
if you're living in London and you're a single mom, let's be honest, you're going to be working at least 2 jobs to make ends meet. And London is an expensive city. So you're working, you've probably got a day job, you've probably got a night job, and you've probably got a 14-year-old son and a 11-year-old.
And all the worries that come from selecting boyfriends
And
that
then
aren't going to be able.
Exactly. How the hell are you supposed to keep an eye on
But it's
these?
become it's maybe something you can. So why has it become a sort of right-wing position to advocate fathers and nuclear family stuff? I got into trouble with my book about masculinity, where I wasn't saying there is a right way of doing this. I was looking at some evidence and saying, well, the evidence seems to tip this way, but that's not to say that single parents and same-sex relationships are.
Yeah.
Why has that become such a dangerous position to take? Especially from the left, you're basically saying, well, you're demonising single mothers. Well, no,
I mean, I think sort of historically, I'm a single mother, and there was a point at which the Tories, under John Major, deliberately targeted single mothers as the source of all evil, And I mean, I've had of the worst meals of my life with Ian Duncan Smith, who lectured me on the evils of single motherhood while I was sitting there thinking, you know, maybe you could ask me something about it rather than tell me. I think possibly, and I've written some very harsh stuff in there, so I have to put my hand up to it. We don't actually know what the role of fathers are anymore, really. So when, I mean, my children have contact with their fathers, and that's, you know, I've always made that happen, that's it, because everyone has said that's the right thing, but I'm not, there was a point where women were encouraged to go out to work in the night, sort of, for me, you know, say in the 90s, and it was all it's like Thatcherite thing going on. Women have just got to get ahead in the workplace, and they've got to have the great relationship with the kids, the career, got to have it all. That was just like a double shift for women, because they were you're doing everything, and then you're like,
picking up the stuff at home.
yeah, and I know so many sort of marriages that collapsed and stuff because the guys weren't pulling their weight.
And they still want their socks picked up on the
Yeah.
bedroom floor.
That's a generational thing.
Get out of my bed.
I hope so, but is it I don't know when you ask whether it's right or left, I'm really on so many of these issues now, really rethinking my own position about what left is. Right? So if you say to me, should we support families? Should we support them? Of course. Should we make the lives of single parents better? Should we encourage people to stay together to be with their kids? I would say, yeah, that's not really a left or right thing. That's just a sort of a good thing. But I do think men have to step up, and many women, and I am one of them, found it easier to bring up their children on their own than with a partner that didn't pull their weight.
My sister-in-law used to be married to an abusive husband.
Oh no, my wife wasn't abusive.
Oh no, but I mean,
just
he was
saying.
well. Okay, well, this guy was useless and abusive.
Yeah,
Let's
well,
just say.
you know.
But also, my mother-in-law had a husband who wasn't great. She now lives with us, and she said to me the other day, because she was saying, I couldn't have gone all the way that she was highly successful in everything that she did, and raised 3 children successfully, and was very high achieving. She says, I couldn't have done it if I was married.
Well, you
I
see,
couldn't have done it. She said, I could only do it because I was a single man.
But it presumably goes both ways anyway. And what, all things being equal, I think maybe this idea that you have a mother and a father is kind of an ideal. If it fails, then obviously everything else you make it work. But the idea that to hold that up as some kind of ideal is itself...
It's just about backing the likely horse, isn't it? It's just which way to bet. It's not applying moral pressure, I think. It's just saying, in all other things being equal, which family is more likely. But you're absolutely right. Once it starts to slide, and once men no longer feel either that they have any personal payoff for being a good father, and neither will society give a damn one way or the other, and they'll still be allowed to drink with their mates, despite having left their family in the lurch, they think, well, sort of it. I think a lot of Peterson stuff has always been like, okay, the patriarchy is so called, the idea that there is a family and he's, the father is the head of the household and he has a certain level of esteem in society, is kind of there, however much it might gall us, because, to be honest, men would quite like to just have their wicked way with women and then disappear before she's even, through the first trimester. And there is, I think a little bit of
Boris
that,
Johnson is our Prime Minister. I mean,
exactly.
This is a
We're comfortable with that. We're very comfortable with that. In families, I agree she is, but that's the point.
My family was,
what I'm saying is, if society gives a kind of gloss to the whole notion that a man is to be respected because he's in high esteem, and this happens around the world, it still happens. Funny enough, go back to Arundhati Roy. This is like, in her view, a big part of what Indian society is. That a man, as long as he's held in high esteem in society, can be an absolute tyrant in his own. Will bat an eyelid or notice that his wife is sporting bruises or whatever.
Yeah.
There is this kind of notion that he is the king of his castle in that respect, and that's not just a British right-wing proposition. That's how higher up, that's how traditional societies have worked.
Was it the same here?
And what I'm saying, to some extent, at that point that it was, a man would, this is the thing that I know. Should it be? Could it be? Would it be? These things get confused. It's not to say that it's morally justified, but it does work to some extent to keep men attached to their family because the society that they live in holds them in high regard for doing so. Nowadays,
In as much as it's important to keep a woman.
yeah, totally,
So
yeah.
it's, you know,
But women, I think, do have, maybe this is controversial now even, but I think women are more inclined to stay with their kids. We feel it like a gut punch when, like, a woman deserts her kids. We still feel that, or let alone a minor Hindu,
Like a
which is
man
like
walks
that,
out.
you know, yeah. It's like, well,
could that be
that'll
considered
happen,
a sexist position?
Oh,
if
it's-
all things being equal, is, to say something like that, could that be considered? You know,
yeah.
you're saying that women are like this and men are that. I mean,
Oh, it is a sexist position, but I think I'm acknowledging something that's been borne out over centuries around the world as having. This is, I think, a lot of society's mechanisms are there initially to offset what would be iniquities, and then they become so entrenched that they overpower those iniquities and they head off on their own. You know, it's just,
Look at the reason for. Sorry, Suzanne.
No, I was just thinking about what James was saying about, is it a fact that it's better for the mum and dad to stay together and all that stuff. And then thinking about what you were saying, and for me, the problem is not really whether we've got this sort of, the conventional family, but the nuclear family has become very isolated. And what you're talking about is an extended family. So I know so many people who wouldn't have an uncle who takes them out and does the things that you say with a 14-year-old.
But they don't. We've lost it, and we lost it centuries ago.
But it's a kind of cultural thing. It's a class thing too. Because I know. When my daughter's boyfriend her partner comes from a sort of solid working class background, and if any of those guys hear of another man who's hit a woman, they're there. I mean, they are there. It is like that's crossed the line, and you do not cross it.
But also that was quite a conservative view.
And yet, but we don't talk about feminists. I'm the weirdest person I've ever met. So it's not. It's just like these. It's quite. To be a man, you don't need to. This is what being a
there's
man.
an honour code, isn't there?
It's an honour thing.
That's
And how do we get to the position where women? We don't go back to the old ways that oppressed women, so women weren't allowed to do things. But we are able to encourage a kind of masculinity that can walk beside. I always say, what do women want? They want men to walk beside. Just feminism for me is don't be a dick. Walk beside me. Don't walk in front of me, and I won't walk behind you. Just walk beside me. It's like that's. I don't have to spend my life, being particularly nice to men I don't like or respecting women or anything like that. But if you want to make respect for women, listen to what they say, and it's absolutely crucial that you bring up your children to have this, have these. These figures on violence are really upsetting me because for me it is, these women during lockdown have been trapped.
Well, lockdown has been an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? It's thrown a lot of things. To me, it's not been like a kind of we've been trying to reverse. It's like a lot of trends that have been happening quietly, have been accelerated. This is why firms like Amazon and South Africa, diseases of isolation, syndromes of atomization have rocketed because that's what was already happening. I said on that Paul Embry Zoom conversation here a couple of weeks ago, and I stand by this like almost more than anything else I believe in about how to amend society, is you need to throw open your front doors and let your kids play out on the street. If there's one thing that could change everything, that would be it for me. Just this nuclear family shit has got to
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
yeah.
I think that's where a lot of unhappiness comes with, because women feel, women initiate divorce, and it's usually more because they feel lonely and they feel isolated, and that's why, as a single parent, when they go and meet other single parents and they hang out together, they feel like,
And one of them says, since I got the divorce, I'm a member of the tennis club.
Also, if you look at the reasons, the statistics behind the reasons for divorce, men will it's incredibly rare that a man will walk out of marriage unless he's going into the arms of another woman. Whereas women will just pull the plug on it and say, I can't take any of this anymore, I'm out of here. And with lockdown, they couldn't do that. Whereas a man will only because he's going to another woman. It's very rare that a man will just pull the plug on the relationship.
I mean, what you said about playing in the streets, I watched a fantastic documentary which I highly recommend. It was called Countless Days of Camberwell, 1969. So things would change. It's incredible because people are still living Victorian lives without signs. And yet 2 streets away, there's the 60s block. And old ladies who grew up in the turn of the century are now suddenly having a loo for the first time. But the thing they keep saying, the people who moved to the 60s blocks, is the one thing that's missing is the ability for their kids to go out and play.
Yeah.
Okay, they lived in squalor in these streets, and they were slums, essentially.
Yeah.
But the kids were constantly playing
Shared
football,
space.
shared space in the
Yeah.
street.
And like even
front
like the
gardens.
most absurdly kind of cartoonish, I find it very amusing. There's a guy called Bronze Age Pervert. Do you know him on Twitter? Bronze Age Pervert. He is folks. Get him. He's like he's a very funny guy. He's been doxxed or whatever. It turns out he's like a Romanian philosophy professor who created this character. But it's very funny. It's quite right. But it's Nietzschean essentially. He wrote a book about it called Bronze Age Mindset, and it's about getting back to sort of martial virtues and Homeric kind of ideas. I think you have to read it tongue in cheek, but like a lot of good tongue in cheek things, it throws up ideas that are powerful. And one of them, he says, is that you live your whole life in owned space. Wherever you go, you don't even have the high street anymore. You go to the mall. The company owns them.
Yeah.
You go from shop to shop, from
No
building to
public
building.
land.
There's no not properly public.
common ground.
No, you can't even. The countryside is all farmed. You have to fucking write. I mean, this is an American kind of viewpoint, but it's the same thing here. You have to fight for ramblers' rights just to walk across a cornfield. It's absurd, We grew up in a place where, like 20 yards from your front door, you were into the unknown again. And for men in particular, I do think, you need to discover those spaces. And I've always said, when I grew up in St Albans, which sounds like the most absurdly middle-class suburban neighbourhood, it's on the M25 now, it wasn't when I grew up. There were still places between built environments. There were still lanes and fields, or even just go, trudging up the track on a hot day with a You can muck about and nobody could say this is my land. Off you go. It's so hard to find.
But stranger danger is really.
I mean, I would go out on the head where I lived. I mean, we'd go out. We'd be out until it got dark. We'd have to come in. No one had phones. You didn't know. I never knew where.
No, you'll be like, I'm going to go and play in the abandoned mine. Be home for dinner.
Don't touch the TNT. No one had lights.
Like now, basically kids are kind of, tagged, aren't they, with the phone? Because obviously they were just
Thank you, Tony.
but
The levels of child abduction are minute.
the fear is.
I wonder how much.
I think the fear is partly stoked. I'm going to say this is a very controversial view. I think it's not rational, but it's partly stoked by diversity. Because I think people naturally feel like, I don't know who these people are, and I don't understand. There's statistics to bear it out. There's a kind of there's that Golden Alone, which was a famous book about this. I think we need to address it and overcome it, and not pretend it doesn't exist. We all live together, but the truth is, he's not more likely to touch your kids than he is. These people they're just like different colour skin, maybe a different style of dress, but there's no big deal. We all need to just relax about
I've
it.
never
Might not be.
I've never met
Middle-aged
like
men
that.
with strange glasses.
Exactly. Well,
I used to watch those videos.
I live in home, which is very low on it, so I'm just saying, I think that's one element that's coming. But also, obviously, the media exaggerating the threat of paedophiles, exaggerating the threat of traffic accidents. The truth is, traffic accidents involving kids are like a fraction. In the old days, Ford Capris used to tear up our road with no functioning brakes at all, with a 16-year-old on Carly back lane. Yes. Nowadays, there's there's a Toyota Pride or whatever it's called. Oh my God! Get the kids away from
But I wonder how much it would go back to the whole shared space thing.
Yeah.
What it does is, like you were saying, Suzanne, about the fact that men would step in if somebody was abusive to their wife, because it removes an unlimited.
Yeah.
You know who the other person is. And once you know who they are and they know who you are, you're accountable to your behaviour.
Yeah, that was the other thing in that documentary.
So it's like, you don't step out of line, because you know that someone's going to knock on your door and drag you out in the street and give you a bloody hiding. And and we completely lost that. And it's the idea that if you're waiting on a junction and I see somebody pulling out who I recognise as my neighbour, I slow down naturally to let them up because you recognise them. and it makes everybody nicer. I grew up in a sort of aspirational working class area of South East London, where everybody knew each other's business, and it was all 90% immigrant community. Everybody knew each other, and we were all there for the same reason. So there was this kind of very classic sense of like, you don't air your dirty laundry in public, but there's always gossip, and always be aware of the gossip. And it does keep you on the straight and narrow. And this is the problem with when you move to an online world, and everyone says, oh, social media is not the real world. It kind of is the real world then nowadays. Let's be honest, it's not the real world, as David was saying last time we spoke.
Yeah.
And it gives you that feeling of complete anonymity that makes you think, well, why can't I call that woman myself?
Yeah,
Why can't I say
yeah.
she's a bitch? And no one's ever going to come after me, are they? But if you try doing that in a mining village in Minefields, you see what happens to you.
It's a lack of consequence, isn't it?
Total lack of consequence. And shared space gives you the confidence in somebody else. They hold you to account, and you hold them to account. And it's that checks and balances that's so important.
Do we think that, like, these kind of traditional family structures and things, I mean, I agree with a lot of the slightly nostalgic memories, but I don't suppose they're going to come back naturally. Would it be justified to try and create legislation or tax in pressures to try and recreate them?
There was a study I read recently, and we mustn't be too nostalgic. And it was about how
Some things are getting better.
and about puberty, how a girl's world shrinks, physical, where she can go, how she can go, who's going to pick her up, how she's going to get there in the boys' world. That's shrinking, but not to the same extent. So lots of girls are the parents. It's two things. The parents are keeping them in, or they never feel safe to go out. I mean, at my daughter's school, all the girls are wearing little shorts. They've got tights, knickers, and little shorts under the skirts, things like that. So, because the boys will upskirt them, and all that. Yeah, but this is just a typical London school. It's not a bad school, but anything like that. So it's just, that girls have to be sort of continually on vibe, not because every man is going to rape them, but because they get a lot of there's a lot of street harassment. I mean, once girls get to about 12, 13, it's really
Because the guys know that they can get away with it.
But also because the
It's
girls are
numbers.
under two pressures, aren't they? On the one hand, they know that there's that hostility, but at the same time, if they dress modestly, that leads to ostracisation as well.
I mean, the sad thing
They
is,
look
a lot
really
of
horribly
young
uncomfortable.
men are very awkward. They don't know how to. It takes a lot of practice. So they say stupid things.
What would you
I'll
do?
go
What
to
would
it
you
too.
do?
I'll go to it.
To educate, would you change it? That sex education lessons would be more about?
I tend to think that parents are the best at sex education. But certainly respecting the opposite sex, I think there's something that schools, not in a preachy way, but it's just in a humanistic way. You just respect other people.
Yeah. Do you think, James, that a lot of this comes down to the fact that we don't have that third generation in the household anymore? So, like years ago, you would typically have your grandparents, your parents, and your kids all in. I was brought up that way. And my grandparents raised me because my parents were working day and night. And I had my grandfather raise me, but also he got married in his 20s. My mum started having kids in her 20s. By the time he was 55, he had all his grandchildren. He sold his little cafe investment.
I'm 56 next week. I would be such a good granddad.
But I mean,
I've
he had
got
the
my kids at
time.
home still.
My grandparents, they have the time, they have the wisdom.
You've got two grandchildren.
And you've got the time and you've got the wisdom, really, if you're retired especially. And you can sort of take the pressure off the parents and say, okay, you guys can do what you
I remember I had two sets. We lived in St Albans, like I say. My mother's parents lived in St Albans and came to us every Thursday afternoon. Drove my mother crazy. They would always come and sit down on the sofa and expect tea and biscuits. And we'd go and see my other grandparents, who also lived in St Albans, at least once a fortnight. And quite often help out in the garden or whatever. My kids haven't seen, this year they haven't seen their grandparents for a year. My parents live in Norfolk. But,
No coffees?
I'll have a coffee, thank you. Yeah, I'll have
coffee.
Cappuccino?
I'll have a
Cappuccino?
Yeah, okay.
James, what coffee?
Yeah, cappuccino.
Cappuccino?
Espresso? Yeah, thanks, my friend. Would anyone like any dessert? I'm fine.
I'm good.
But they don't see them at all, and the others they see maybe once a month or whatever. And even then, there's no. You have to actually live with people or see them quite frequently for them to feel any confidence in saying, you spoil that child. So-and-so's getting fat. You know, you can't say that if you see them once a year. You don't want to spoil the day, do you? They need to be
I
part of
had
it.
my daughter and partner and child living with me as a result of the pandemic.
Right.
So I am
Sorry, your daughter and her partner.
and
Yeah.
their baby.
Right.
So I am.
So you are that person.
I am. But I really try to. I mean, they have a separate space and we share the bathroom, but otherwise they're possible. I really try not to judge how they do it because I'm sending them loud because I can see that things change. For instance, when when they were little, I worked all the time. I just worked all the time. And my daughter's really chosen, probably I would say, to probably have less money and to be with their children. I think that's the choice they've made, and I respect that. You know, and I think it's that. I just was like,
Do you regret working too hard?
no,
You don't know how.
and I'm still, you know, I'm not a baby person. I love them once they start to toddle about and talk. You know,
When
so
they become interesting.
yes.
I love them when they start to do Led Zeppelin guitar
Yes.
solos.
But but somebody said to my daughter the other day, because she explained that she was living at home, and they said, and they had I can't remember the word, you're doing that kind of parenting to me. There's a
Oh
word
yeah,
for
like
it.
gentle parenting or
And
severe
it wasn't.
parenting.
It was just like, no, they had a flat, they couldn't, during the pandemic, his wages went right down, they ended up living with me. And do you know what, I like it, but I don't feel that I'm there to show them how to.
That's interesting because we were talking about that earlier. How much of your parenting is down to your decision making?
Yeah.
And how much it's passed on from without you even necessarily knowing it. You've inherited all your parents' kind of dysfunctions as well. That's the danger, isn't it? Man hands on misery to man, all that stuff. It's like, where do our parenting skills begin and
you
end?
know that thing where you find the things that you said, I will never say that to my kid.
Yeah, and you do.
And then you do.
Yeah.
We all do that. Right?
But I think most people grow up thinking, I'm going to do things differently. I don't care what kind of parenting style you live under, you're persuaded because it's human nature.
Yeah, to
You go
rebel.
through our life, you think, oh, they did that wrong and I blame them for my lack of discipline or lack of ambition or lack of focus, whatever. In truth, I think actually the evidence seems now to support this notion that you're genetically predisposed to a certain to a huge extent. Not totally and absolutely, but your parents, this should encourage parenting because it's a much less responsible position as long as you're there for them and you keep them
there's only
safe
so much.
and you show a degree of kindness
I
and you keep
really
them fed,
like
it's
that.
fine.
Is it Bruno that thing, you're the good enough.
Yeah,
You're the good enough.
yeah.
You're never going to be perfect. And people are trying to be perfect, they really screw themselves
Yeah,
massively.
that's
But
right.
like you say, you're there. You just be
Yeah.
there.
Up and down.
And I don't think
Yes,
I
exactly.
don't think you can be any better to them than you are to yourself.
Yeah.
So you have to look up, make sure that you're fully functioning, so that you can be fully functioning.
I
The
mean,
weird thing is, though, some of the highest achieving people in the history of the world have come out of really bad families.
When you
sometimes
have
it's
you read the biographies of Boris Johnson? I mean, Jesus, that family.
I don't know if he is that high achieving. I
No,
know that.
It's my office.
well, some people might think being Prime Minister is quite high.
Somehow he's made it look like a failure.
I don't know how you're measuring achievement here.
Well, I felt Tony Blair was a pretty high achieving Prime Minister, and he felt he wasn't happy with the way he was going.
Yeah.
I can't remember the details. I think with people like Johnson, I hate him as a phenomenon. I don't mind him that much one way or the other as an individual, but as a thing that he represents, I think he endorses a view that is very prevalent in society at the moment. We're off the track of it. But that kind of people just breathe through life and run everything, and the table is tilted in their direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm like, oh God, just when I'm thinking, actually it's more complicated than that, you see him get there and you just go, no, it's not, is it? It's just that still. It's just bad.
He's like the anti-king energy, isn't he?
Yeah.
You're talking about this, about like men need that stable king energy in society to keep everybody in check. There was this case I remember ages ago, I can't remember when, in Botswana, where they had problems with all the elephants started going rogue. And they had all these teenage elephants,
the must.
Yeah,
Is it
basically
must?
going around sort of trampling or something. They couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And then they realised that for one reason or another, hunting, poaching, whatever, all the older elephants had basically died. So somebody said, okay, well let's tranquilise and helicopter in older elephants, these kind of like older ones. And they put down 2 older elephants in there. And it just calmed everything down. It completely subdued everything.
A
It calmed
very
everything
rare
down.
occasion in which a biological intervention doesn't lead to an escalation.
I mean, I just think that you've got to have that kind of level of that sort of that good king structure, that good king energy that keeps everything in place. And you think, who is that? Is that Boris? Is that who it is? Because if that's who it is, then God help us all.
I mean,
Ambition, fierce ambition.
but he also,
It's not even properly ambitious though. I feel he's not been the worst thing that's ever happened to this country, but I do always feel a slight pressure to sort of defend himself.
Why?
What sort of a man is he though? If we're talking about masculinity, is he
The
an alpha man?
alternative to Corbyn, I suppose, at that point, it just seems such a disastrous alternative.
God, I mean,
Well,
he's
he's very similar.
I mean,
But he's very similar.
they're both narcissists.
yeah,
And,
that's interesting.
I
Yes, I
mean,
think so. Yeah.
Would you say he was alpha?
Boris.
Yeah.
I guess I would.
I don't think he is. No.
But he's,
Cameron kind of was.
yeah.
Can I say, I have a small observation about alpha, which is I think is one of those terms we've imported from David Attenborough.
Yeah,
I'm not sure it really applies, but as a stand-up, when you do a 20-minute set in front of an audience that respond to it and get engaged, and then go off to the bar afterwards just to get a drink for yourself, not to soak it up the adoration. I will always encounter a couple of men who have felt their own alpha status with their own girlfriend, threatened by who I was on stage, just the degree to which I was holding everyone's attention. I want to come up, not aggressively, but just reassert their own dominance.
Yeah.
And I'm always immediately like, it's fine, honestly, that's an actual
I
thing.
get
That's
that.
what
I
need
get
to
that in
do.
a restaurant.
Do you?
Yeah. If a guy's on a date,
Yeah.
then I typically say to my wife, I say, you look after that table. Because if I go there, it's the barbs. You get this constant barbs.
Run all these people.
And the stupid Italian accents that they put on, and you just think, oh, give
Worried
it a
that they're
rest.
fancy.
But what's interesting is that when I started having children, I've got 3 kids now. When my wife was first pregnant, I noticed a sharp decline in that. And I wonder if that's where they thought, oh, well,
You
he's
were
about
giving
to be a
off a slightly
dad. I was
different-
giving off a slightly different. And they say that when a woman is pregnant, the partner's testosterone level dips very slightly. And I wonder how much of that is sort of.
Can we get onto this? Testosterone is really interesting to me. I don't know if I mentioned this to you personally, but I do it. I've done it on the show that was cancelled due to lockdown. I was in real trouble about 3 years ago. A lot of mental fog, really indecisive, really struggling, depression. Couldn't see my way through life. And I got blood tests done, and I had catastrophically low testosterone, really low, off the bottom of the red. They had to put a new mark on the graph to show where mine was. And that might have just been a bad morning, but anyway, I signed up. I do a lot set about it in the show about how I gradually sort of worked my way through to getting testosterone replacement therapy, similar to what women, of course, have when they hit menopause, and they almost universally find it helps them. But very few men, I think, are aware that it can be as serious. Now, I don't know how long that had been going on. I honestly think sometimes that when I think about my whole life, I could easily have been actually struggling with that more than I realised. That a lot of, in my 20s, I really struggled after university to make a decision about where to live and to get myself a flat. I was sofa surfing for ages for no reason, no good reason. I could earn money, I was intelligent and had a degree, but there were all kinds of things. I don't know what it might have been. But testosterone has got a really bad rap in society at the moment. It's sort of associated with toxic masculinity and so on. There's this idea that people who have too much testosterone represent a threat, or that there's a kind of, that Tyrannosaurus Rex book, Cordelia Fine, I think, wrote, which is, I haven't read it, I should, I'm not going to attack it without having done so, but a perception that it's a shibboleth of men's rights activists that have testosterone and they have this, blah, blah, blah. But I think we really underestimate the degree to which hormonal health, basically, is like the bedrock of being able to be the kind of person you need to be. And I'm not sure how universal it is at the moment. Certainly we know that fertility, sperm counts are plummeting, much lower levels of all this kind of stuff. I don't really know why. I think it must be environmental, because it's not happening in the less developed world. It seems to be associated with possibly estrogen runoff from
from tap water.
tap water. It might be to do with plastic bottles. It might be to do with soy products. It
I
could
did
be
it-
a complex of
yeah.
all these things, and it's also affecting animal life. Like I read one thing about it was a woman called Deborah Cadbury, who I think is part of the Cadbury family. But anyway, she wrote a book about it, about these sort of problems in nature generally. They were in, I think, Florida, and taking alligator samples that had like mangled sexual organs. That they were like really small and weren't really functioning. This due to an environmental thing that alligators were encountering, and yet they really struggled to work out what it is. It's like we're still trying to unpick it, but what it isn't is not being taken seriously. I don't think
I did
anyone
a piece about the
seriously
male
seems to think it's
menopause.
serious.
The male menopause, I think is a real thing. I got a lot of flack for it because women say, excuse
Get over yourself.
Yeah, but so no, I mean, I met an interview someone called Marion Clark who specialised in hormone replacement, and she, I was convinced by it. I mean, having been very sceptical, I think when you start to lose your testosterone, all of your sexual desire starts to go for one, which definitely affects your mood. You start to lose your confidence and self-esteem can go. So I think one thing definitely needs to happen. I think we've definitely underestimated the power of hormones.
I think so. Hugely. I think hormones.
Who goes to the GP nowadays and gets their hormones?
No. You have to pay. I mean, I paid happily to get the blood test, but then you go to the GP with the results, and they.
Because you have those disgusting lozenge things.
For the testosterone, they gave me something called Testogel, which was very much like the alcohol-based sort of hand cleansing stuff. And you wipe it into your upper arms, and I mean, I talk about
Wake
it.
up with
It mainly
biceps.
seemed to enrage dogs. Just, I didn't feel any better. But I'm
Raised
basically
or
giving
turned
off-
on.
Yeah, that's right. So you need an injection, really.
Yeah, fertility rates globally are dropping. It's a real. I went and did a story with the UN in Armenia because they. Everybody knows there's fetal sex selection goes on in Pakistan, in China, and India. It actually goes on in lots of other places. In Armenia, is one of the massive majorities of that. So, like, you can literally walk into a classroom and there'll be 20 little boys and 5 girls. So, because it's an ex-Soviet country, abortion is almost like a form of contraception. So, I was interviewing women who had, I mean, obviously I'm not against abortion. Young women who had like 12 abortions because they were girls. So the UN guys up with them, fantastic. They know all about this stuff. They were so smart and so clever. And they were saying as fertility rates drop, in these traditional societies value boys as earners, really, because a lot of Armenians go and work in Russia. You will get this fetal sex selection, and we've really got to do something about it. And I often think about the people I met there, all about stuff. I learnt so much, but part of the whole sort of, I don't want to get stuck on it, but the whole trans argument is that sex is a sign of birth, so it's a random thing. Well, actually, sex is a sign in a fetal scan around 12 weeks, and people make decisions based on that. But fertility is an issue. Hormones, I agree, completely are an issue. When I had menopause, I realised I knew less about what was going to happen to me when I started to have periods. And I consider myself an informed, intelligent woman. I didn't have any idea about what was happening.
You have to ask neighbours, don't you?
I went to ask who?
Neighbours. My wife asked neighbours. She had an extra neighbour. She was like,
My next
I
door
feel
the
really.
Turkish guy. It'd be really very weird if I asked my neighbour what was going on with my mate. No, I remember going to my GP who was lovely, and she said, "Well, you're perimenopause," and I'm like, "What's that?" Peri. It's a stage before you. And could be 10 years old. 10 years? And then I went home, started reading about it and trying to understand what. Because I wasn't having a terrible time apart from insomnia, but insomnia is hormonal, absolutely hormonal. Because my insomnia was caused by too much cortisol, which is your opposite hormone to insulin. Because what happens is when the body can't reproduce, you have to kickstart the ovaries. It's just a sort of, it's almost like we are basically just animals, aren't we? And this stuff happens. So you're producing this cortisol, and that's what's causing insomnia. So they kept trying to give me antidepressants, and I kept saying, I'm not depressed. This isn't.
I'm not depressed. You know, this is, but it's a physical thing going on. And then I started looking at I've read Marilyn Black's work. That stuff didn't work for me. I think it works really well for some people. But I just realised, as you're saying, Simon, how little we know about that stuff, and the models that we use, and the kind of moral judgments we make around the interaction between our minds and bodies, really, and that's where hormones come in, because they really, I mean, even with COVID, it was clear from the beginning, it was more men were going to get COVID, but more, first of all, they were putting it down to lifestyle, smoking, and then they realised it's got more global, just men are more prone to it. Women are more prone to autoimmune disease. You know, it's like, we are different. We should, I think that thing of not being able to say, like, there are actually,
and it's not borne out in statistics.
There are differences between men and women, and that doesn't mean that we can't be. We can be, you know, that doesn't mean we can't be equal, but we should acknowledge.
But I think something else is happening, which is muddying the waters, especially in terms of the male-female divide, which is that I think we're exposed to a lot of environmental stresses now, which haven't been there, especially, I suspect, chemical ones.
Yes.
And consequently, we have, as societies and cultures, developed responses to how you should, when you get past a certain age, culturally, historically, socially, most people take it upon themselves to stay fit, stay healthy, don't drink too much, and these are the virtues, and these are the sins, and this is how you behave, and you'll be all right. And now suddenly those they're not necessarily adequate, because we are exposed to stresses and pressures, as I say, many of them, I call them stresses, but I mean things in the water or whatever, that are more challenging, that make it harder for you to be a good person. You know, I mean, it really is literally that. It's like, it's hard to be a good person if your hormones are out of
But how much of what you said about your hormone, how much of your problems with depression and stuff was to do with that? Did you get
like pretty much totally. I mean, as soon as I got the injection, I was right back up on top of the water again instead of underneath it. Yeah,
amazing.
and I was really thinking, I don't know if I can carry on. I mean, not to talk about suicidal ideation, but you think it's hard being a stand-up if you don't kind of feel like you're on top of your game. You know, you're only on stage half an hour.
Your whole work
but
depends on it. It's the crux of it.
On top of which you've got kids and their problems and. Yeah,
I mean, the whole mental health thing is interesting.
Everyone wants to be on top of their game.
It's become very much a sort of.
And what Kate said, my wife, you know, she was like surprised. You know, you get testosterone, and now you're much less what she thinks of as like toxic masculinity, which is to say, much less snappy,
less
Victorian dad, irritable. Yeah, exactly. You're much more relaxed in your own skin, and
I wonder how much of this, like the whole mental health things that we're talking about now, is going to. I'm quite optimistic about the future because of the use of psychedelics and the use of psilocybin, which I think now for the first time for so long, it's becoming more mainstream. And I think you look at all the problems that it's really curing. And they look, depression, anxiety, addictions, PTSD. And I'm wondering how much of that now is actually, this kind of sense of this almost, because they've been used for centuries.
James, I just got sent Michael Pollan's new book. He's a man who was a figure. Yeah, it's called Plant Medicine, and it's called great title, Opium, Caffeine, Mescaline. nice title.
That's a great
title.
Take it together.
Yeah, but no, they are. I mean, not just for sort of recreational purposes. I mean, they are using it in John Hopkins also for terminally ill people.
Yeah, there's actually Michael Pollan.
And it's when I was doing my therapy course, a lot of the younger people were microdosing, and I thought I'm interested in that stuff because.
Is this for depression?
No.
Just
creativity a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean they would be quite open about it, and they'd say, because there's a supervision once every 3 days, a tiny amount, and so 2 or 3 days. The last couple of days was great, and then today I think I wasn't connected. I was all over the shop. I've done it's too much. I've done too much. I haven't done anything that I did. But some people do it for depression. Some people do it to increase their flow. I mean, it's not something that I think it's not something you would do forever. But you might want to have a go at it for a month. As well. I mean, I did a mushroom. Just when all this before the shit hit the fan at the Guardian. it was. But I was partly interested in going because I wanted to know about. It cost £2,000, and I wanted to know who pays £2,000 to take some mushrooms.
Where is it in Holland?
Mushrooms or
£2,000.
ayahuasca.
Mushrooms, just truffles.
To take £2,000, you should just buy them in Camden Market.
I was going to say.
That's
like,
why. That's partly what I told the story on, right?
Yeah.
Was because I was doing it for a newspaper. Was what kind of people, you know? Yeah, £2,000. And not only had they, when I got there, not only had they paid £2,000, they'd flown in from New York and Camden.
Stayed in hotels.
We stayed in it. It was fantastic. I mean, it was luxury. I mean, it should be for 3 days, £2,000.
This is the future of tourism. It's like people go to Thailand for
But
plastic surgery.
So we're a group of 12. 4 of the people were doctors. There was a lot of kind of group therapy stuff before we took these truffles.
Love mushrooms.
Yeah, I don't know really my thing,
Should
but
get them on the menu here, James.
and,
Environmental health might have something to say about
you
that.
see, it was all a legal thing because they actually truffles. They made the table beautiful, and then you made your own tea and drank it. My thing was, and I disrupted. I know I didn't mean to disrupt the group, but I did because I kept asking, like when we're like, you know, taking mushrooms, what music? Music's really important to me. I love music, and I wanted to listen to the music. I wanted to listen to it. And they said, no, we have a special soundtrack that Imperial College put together to take you through your trip. And I said, if it's that
Real song.
blinky plonky, very
New
music,
waves.
I don't,
Yeah,
you know, I don't
Endless
want it.
resolutions.
And you know, I'm lying there, we were all lying there, we've all been brushed with sage and had some magic ritual, and the Dutch people are very Dutch, you know. And I'm lying there, you have the blindfold, and then I can feel the muscle starting a bit, and then music, and I just lie there. And then everyone has a guide, and mine was sort of sitting across there, just behind me, meditating, etc. And I was trying to in the end, and then within about an hour or so, somebody was sobbing and crying and screaming. Nothing much was happening for me, but that's because I'm a hardcore, you know, sort of person. And some particularly awful bit of music ended, and I said, thank fuck for men and their play tracks, their playlists. And everybody started laughing, but the person in charge came and said, would you like to be taken out of the sacred circle? And I said, yes, very much.
Is there a pub that's open?
So I was then taken to this lovely room, and a medical student was assigned me. This is what cost £2,000. This is totally safe. I said, can I go and get a book through it? And they said, no, does anything happen? I said, no, I just...
Because it's literally just mushrooms, psilocybin.
Yes!
This is absurd.
People have been doing this for.
I take mushrooms up in the Lake District and go like walking. I mean, it's been a while. But,
I know.
It's not hard.
So I was being like I'm lying on a couch saying, and they said, and I felt a bit yawny, but I just wasn't tripping at all. And I said, look, can I get a book? I'm actually a bit bored now. And they said, well, I said, you're Dutch. What music? Maybe some David Bowie. Yeah, all right.
You look like you might like David Bowie.
Yeah, okay, that's okay. But because I said, how's it going to be other people? I said, oh, they're going to be in there for about 8 hours, and they're not going to eat, you know, for after. Oh my god. But anyway, it was a. Since then, I've done the sort of Camden job, if you like, which does the job in a completely safe place. What I can't understand, and always say to my children is, you know, you just don't wander around festivals off your head. You know, just try and stick the same people and do it. But as a treatment for depression and for mental health and for anxiety, I mean, we're very scared of it, but it is working.
It'd be interesting what you were saying earlier about James about rites of passage and stuff about entering manhood. I think possibly a psychedelic experience could be quite a useful part of that as well.
I've never had one. I've never done mushrooms, so I wouldn't know.
It humiliates in a good sense.
It's sort of ego detachment, isn't it? It's taking you away from yourself.
Yeah, and you realise the things you don't know and the things you've taken for granted.
And you feel a sense of connection.
Yeah,
to other,
and you realise that you're sort of part of it.
Yeah.
If you look at the 12-step program, for example, which is based really on the Ignatian spirituality.
Ignatian?
Yeah, like Jesuit spirituality. It's all, they're all
Is
based,
that Jesuit?
so they're all based on the same principles.
Yeah.
You are not important.
No.
It's not about you.
Yeah.
You're not in control.
Yeah.
You are going to die. You have to accept the situation for what it is.
Yeah, you're a cork on the ocean.
Exactly, you're a cork on the ocean. And I think that, the 12-step program is probably the closest we've got to modern day.
Funny enough, Russell
Initiation.
Brand wrote a good book about it. I thought about his 12-step journey. It was pretty good, and it was quite. It came across quite humble,
Yeah.
And,
But I mean, I think psilocybin, I think these things have the power to do that.
yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for bearing with us as we delve into our psychedelic past. This has been a common sanity discussion with Suzanne Moore, James Chiavarini, James Innes-Smith, and myself, Simon Evans. I do hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you again next time. Thank you.